fortress looms against the pallid sky, its towers jutting like jagged teeth into the thinning night. One stands apart, tall, gaunt, withdrawn from the others, as if the stone itself knows to keep its distance. Dawn's first light struggles to reach it, the shadows clinging stubbornly to its walls. At its crown, a narrow window gapes. You watch men swarm around it on creaking scaffolds, their breath white in the morning chill. The thud of their boots, the scrape of trowels, the wet, final slap of mortar. Each sound lands like the ceiling of a tomb. The opening shrinks with every pass of their hands, brick swallowing brick, until only a sliver of the sky remains. From that narrowing gap seeps a sound, faint, stifled, unsteady. It quivers between a cry and a prayer, too soft to carry, yet sharp enough to make the skin along your arms rise. The workers hear it too, but their faces remain fixed on their task, their eyes fixed anywhere but the stone they lay. The wind catches the banners above, snapping them to life with a dry, impatient crack. It carries with it a strange scent, cloying and unfamiliar, thick with resinous sweetness, undercut by something sour and metallic. The smell grows heavier as you near the tower's base, where thin veins of smoke seep from the cracks around the heavy door. They coil upward in ghostly spirals, curling against the cold air before sinking low, as though reluctant to leave. Within that smoke lies a suffocating perfume. Myrrh, frankincense, and other bitter herbs burned in fear of invisible poisons that move through the air. Miasma, the old enemy. The same superstition that sealed plague houses now rises here, in the court of kings. Servants drift across the yard with lowered heads, their steps quickening as they pass the tower. No one looks too long. No one lingers. Behind their silence hangs the weight of another truth, one never spoken aloud in daylight. A final brick slides into place, mortar pressed firm. The window vanishes. The tower exhales no more light, only the slow, steady curl of smoke through the cracks, marking the moment the last breath of the outside world was taken from whatever waits inside. Here in Echoes of Time, we uncover the stories that were never meant to escape their walls. If you've ever wondered what the air inside those rooms felt like, subscribe now before this tale is bricked over again. Before the smoke, before the bricked windows, she was the brightest light in the stone-bound palace. Born beneath the clang of cathedral bells and the watch of armored men, the princess grew into a creature both delicate and dangerous. Delicate in the way she laughed, dangerous in the way her presence bent the attention of every hall toward her. At court, she moved between pillars and tapestries as if the corridors themselves belonged to her. In the gardens, she stripped off her gloves to feel the raw texture of rose petals against her skin. She was 8 years old, yet already trained to bow at the right depth for foreign envoys, to hold her gaze steady when men twice her age tried to read her face. Her tutors called her a quick study. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered that she was too clever by half. To visiting dignitaries she was a symbol, living proof of the dynasty's bloodline, a jewel to be set in another kingdom's crown through marriage. Behind closed doors, the court worked on her future like craftsmen cutting a gem. A match was being shaped between her and a boy prince in a neighboring realm, a union that promised to bind 2 thrones together and cool the smoke of a brewing war. Her life was more than her own. It was a scaffold holding up half the kingdom's political hopes. Her survival was not a matter of affection. It was statecraft. And then came the slip, a moment so small it could have gone unnoticed, were it not for the way such moments bloom into ruin. It happened in the walled garden, near the fountain ringed with marbled lions. She was chasing a pet falcon unhooded too soon, its wings battering the winter air. In her sprint, she caught her ankle against a splintered bench, the wood breaking her skin in a thin, ragged tear. Blood welled bright, staining the white fur at her hem. A servant pressed a cloth to it and muttered that it was nothing. In the city below, a cut like that would be washed with river water, bound with rags and prayed over. In noble houses, treatment was not always better, only richer in scent. Her ladies dabbed at it with rosewater and vinegar. The physician was summoned but delayed, caught in a consultation over a merchant's son. For a day it was ignored in favor of lessons and etiquette drills. But hygiene in these walls was a matter of appearance, not sterility. The palace bathed in perfumes, yet its stone floors harbored centuries of grime. Water was drawn from wells lined with the same limestone that bred slow sickness in the gut. The linens on her bed were soft, but washed in basins where other garments had been left to steep. In a time before the world knew bacteria, a splinter carried as much danger as any blade. By the third day, the skin around her ankle had reddened, swollen tight as a drum. A streak of heat climbed her calf. Fever kissed her cheeks. Still, the court murmured reassurances, too invested in their vision of her future to believe in its undoing. If you believe history is kinder to its princesses than to its peasants, you might want to stay for what's coming. And if you don't, tell me in the comments why you think the court chose bricks over mercy. The fever did not break. By the seventh night, the princess's breath came in shallow bursts, her ankle blackening at the edges like parchment singed by a flame. Servants whispered of a smell seeping from her chamber, a sickly sweet taint that clung to their skin after they left. The court physician blamed it on the air itself, claiming the sickness was borne on invisible vapors, drifting like ghosts through the corridors. The response was swift and ceremonial. Priests were summoned before dawn, their chants echoing through the stone halls as they carried censers heavy with smoke. They circled her bed 3 times, sprinkling holy water until the coverlet was damp, muttering blessings meant to purify the air. At the same time, apothecaries arrived with baskets of dried lavender, rosemary, and crushed juniper berries, their hands already stained from grinding resins. The order came from the regent. Every opening in her chamber was to be sealed. Masons, usually called to repair ramparts, were brought into the heart of the palace. They worked in silence, layering brick and stone over the narrow windows until no daylight remained. The seams of the door were stuffed with cloth soaked in vinegar, the threshold lined with molten wax to trap the poison within. It was an act born of belief, not evidence. Medieval medicine was a battlefield of ideas. One camp devoted to the miasma theory, insisting that foul air spread disease. Another, smaller and quieter, beginning to suspect that sickness passed from person to person through touch and fluids. In the writings of Guy de Chauliac, the great surgeon of Avignon, there were hints of sterility and cleanliness. Yet his own pages still urged fumigation and the carrying of sweet herbs as protection. The old ideas held the court in their grip. But sealing the room was more than medicine. To some, it was a mask for shame. Illness in a royal child could be read as weakness in the bloodline, dangerous when foreign powers were weighing the worth of an alliance. Others whispered in darker tones. Perhaps the wound had not come from a splinter, but from something more scandalous. A lover's tryst turned violent, a poison meant for another. In such a court, a bricked window could hide more than fever. Beyond the palace walls, the city swelled with rumor. In the taverns, men argued over mugs of ale. Was it plague, or witchcraft, or punishment from heaven? A butcher swore his cousin's wife had seen a royal servant buying sacks of lime at the market, used to cover the scent of decay. The baker's apprentice claimed the princess had been cursed by a visiting noblewoman. Even the clergy could not agree. Was she a vessel of innocence under attack, or a sinner reaping the wages of her secret sins? The sealing was complete in a day. From that moment, the princess lived in a coffin made of air and stone, her breath shared only with the smoke of burning herbs. Outside her door, guards stood at attention, their faces unreadable. Inside, the world narrowed to the rhythm of her fever and the slow settling of dust on the windowsills that no longer saw the sun. Echoes of Time exists to unseal stories like this. If you want the walls to keep crumbling, you know where the subscribe button is. And if you don't, I dare you to tell me why in the comments. The air inside the chamber no longer moved. Without the breath of the outside wind, it settled thick and stale, carrying the weight of every candle burned, every herb scorched, every exhalation the princess forced from her lungs. The walls seemed to press inward, as though the stone itself was suffocating alongside her. The darkness was not complete, but it was close. Only the dull flicker of oil lamps kept the room from folding into shadow. That light did not warm. It wavered against the damp sheen of the walls, glinted off metal basins, and died in the folds of heavy curtains that would never again be drawn back. The smell was the first thing anyone noticed when they crossed the threshold. Even masked behind the perfume of frankincense and crushed lavender, it came forward sickly sweet, clinging to the tongue, seeping into hair and clothes. Beneath it lay a darker note, metallic and earthy, the scent of flesh in rebellion against itself. Servants sent to tend her rarely lasted more than a few minutes, excusing themselves with pale faces and trembling hands. She lay in the great bed carved for a princess, but it had become a sickbed in every sense. Her hair clung in damp ropes to her temples, her skin flushed with fever and mottled where the heat could not reach. Some days she spoke in a tangle of languages, snatches of Latin prayers from her tutors, lullabies in her nurse's dialect, only to fall silent, her eyes fixed on something in the corner that no one else could see. The treatments came in steady rhythm, each one steeped in the medical wisdom of the age. Herbal poultices, pressed warm against her ankle and thigh, left stains of yellow and green on the linens. Vinegar fumigation filled the air until it bit at the eyes, meant to drive away invisible poisons. Honey was packed into the wound to draw out corruption, thick and golden in the lamplight, its sweetness at war with the bitterness of infection. But the enemy was advancing. The skin around the wound had turned from red to deep violet, then to the ashen black of dead wood. The flesh swelled, tense as if it might split, and when it did, the discharge was dark, heavy, and hot. In another age, the word gangrene would be known and feared. Here, it was simply the mark of decay, an omen of the body's slow surrender. Fever drove the corruption inward, toward the blood itself, and septicemia began its work, stealing strength from her muscles, slowing her speech, drawing the world away from her senses. The surgeon argued for the blade. He spoke of cutting above the knee, of fire sealing the stump, of life spared if limb was sacrificed. His voice carried the conviction of a man who had seen death and believed he could outpace it. The royal physician recoiled. Amputation, to him, was a crude desecration, a mark of failure that no princess should bear. He clung to purges and fumigation, to bloodletting and prayer, insisting that the balance of humors could be restored. The queen, whether in truth or in the regent's shadow, stood between them. To save her daughter meant condemning her to a lifetime marked by absence. To preserve her whole risked losing her entirely. In a court where appearance was as binding as law, such choices could tilt the fate of a kingdom. These are the moments history left behind stone and silence. Break those walls with us. Subscribe to Echoes of Time. And if you won't, tell me why such stories should stay buried. Beyond the sealed chamber, the palace had not fallen silent. It had shifted. The corridors once filled with the sound of her steps and laughter now echoed with the low hum of council meetings and the scraping quills of scribes drafting proclamations that would never be sent. Invitations to foreign envoys were withdrawn under the pretext of indisposition. The negotiations for her betrothal, which had been carefully spun between two thrones, faltered and then stopped entirely. Without the promise of her hand, the threads binding uneasy allies began to loosen. In the great hall, the king's chair sat empty more often than not. His days were spent pacing outside the sealed tower or sending for physicians from distant cities. In his absence, others began to move. Uncles who had once bowed low now spoke more boldly in council. Ministers who had been content to serve now questioned who would rule if the princess could not be saved. Every day she lingered in that darkened room. The space she left behind in the line of succession became a temptation. Whispers slid through the palace like smoke under a door. Some said the illness was divine judgment, a warning to the dynasty to alter the course of its rule. Others claimed the girl's fate was already sealed, that the tower was not to heal her, but to ensure she did not recover. In the candlelit corners of private chambers, there were those who quietly admitted that her death might simplify everything. A throne without a living heir could be claimed by those with stronger armies and swifter blades. Beyond these walls, history had seen this before. In the courts of Europe, a royal illness could end alliances faster than war. The betrothed of Isabella of Aragon never took his place beside her. Her early death unraveled years of diplomatic maneuvering between Spain and Portugal. In England, The frailty of young Edward VI opened the door to the ambitions of John Dudley, whose power rose not through bloodline but through the weakness of one. A single child's absence from a public balcony could tilt the balance of kingdoms. The regent, whether father, mother, or guardian, faced a choice sharpened by politics. To save her through desperate measures could leave her marked, diminished in the eyes of courts that valued perfection. To let her slip away might strengthen the dynasty in ways that survival could not. In such a place, love and ambition spoke in the same voice, and mercy was weighed against advantage. If you've followed echoes of time before, you know every sealed room hides more than just its prisoner. Subscribe so the next locked door we open isn't missed. And if you think the court was right to keep her hidden, defend it below. It began with a change so small that only the most watchful noticed. For days, her fever had burned without pause, her pulse thready and weak, her skin a battlefield between pallor and blotched heat. Then, in the hour before dawn, her breathing eased. Her lips, once cracked and dry, parted for water. When the royal physician touched her ankle, expecting the familiar burning swell, he felt instead a stubborn coolness. The surgeon called it a false dawn, the fleeting calm before the final descent. The queen or regent called it a sign. Word passed in whispers up and down the spiral stair. Some claimed a new salve of honey and garlic had turned the tide. Others swore the Moorish healer's prayers had reached her where the priest's Latin had failed. No one agreed on the cause, but all knew what it meant. The room, sealed against sky and earth, would have to be opened. At sunrise, the work began in reverse. Masons climbed the scaffolds they had left weeks before, their tools striking against stone with a hollow echo. The first brick came loose reluctantly, the mortar clinging as though it understood what release might bring. Light speared through the narrow gap, a blade of gold cutting across the dust-heavy air. One by one, the openings widened, until the chamber's long-starved walls drank in the day. The door, swollen in its frame from weeks of damp, gave way with a groan. Fresh air surged inward, cool and sharp, stirring the rank perfume of herbs and decay. Servants staggered back, coughing, not from the clean air, but from the sudden churn of all that had been trapped within. For the princess, the change was more dangerous still. After long confinement, the rush of oxygen could shock a weakened body. In other cases, recorded in old physicians' journals, the sudden flood of fresh air after isolation had brought on chills, delirium, even death. She lay still, eyes half closed against the light, as if the brightness was an intruder. The fever had loosened its grip, but it had left her altered. Her ankle was no longer the angry wound it had been. The blackness had halted, edged by a livid scar that would never fade. She had been spared the surgeon's knife, but not the mark of the struggle. The court declared it a miracle. Bells rang in the city below, the sound bouncing off walls that had kept silent for so long. Yet in the corners of the palace, the whispers persisted. That her recovery came too late to mend the broken alliances, that the girl who emerged from the dark was not the same as the one who entered it. She had survived, but the memory of the sealed room clung to her like the scent of its smoke, a reminder that even in rescue, there can be ruin. In the months that followed, the sealed room became both a memory and a shadow. The princess, though alive, was no longer simply a child of the court. She carried herself differently, more slowly, as if her limbs had learned caution in the darkness, and with an intensity in her gaze that unsettled those who met it. The scar that curled above her ankle was never hidden. She wore it as others wore jewels, letting the court see that she had been to the edge and returned. Her survival gave her a strange authority. When physicians quarreled over the merits of fumigation versus surgical intervention, she spoke with the quiet certainty of one who had endured both. Honey poultices, she insisted, had been her salvation, and she pressed for their continued use, not only for nobles, but for the soldiers and the poor who filled the city's infirmaries. Her voice began to bend the will of the court's healers, and even the regent found it hard to deny her when she spoke from the weight of her ordeal. Yet not all found comfort in her return. Some noble houses whispered that the months behind bricked windows had changed her too much. They spoke of how she stared too long at open windows, how she seemed to count the beats between her heart's pulses, how she could sit in silence for hours without moving. To them, she was a reminder of how close the crown had come to cracking. In other courts, her story was told differently. There, she was the princess who had defied death, her will strong enough to outlast the darkness. Like Eleanor of Castile, whose long illnesses never stilled her influence over a kingdom, or Isabel of Aragon, whose injuries reshaped the politics of two realms, she became a figure wrapped in both admiration and caution. Her ordeal was folded into diplomatic conversations, offered as proof of her endurance or, depending on the speaker, as a warning of her fragility. But had she died, the tower would have taken on a different life entirely. The bricks would have been left unmortared, the windows sealed forever, the chamber untouched, a reliquary for grief and a warning against delay in treatment. Her passing would have been carried in the songs of the streets, turned into a cautionary tale that reached far beyond the palace gates. Stories would have told of a young girl suffocated not by sickness, but by the fear and superstition of those sworn to protect her. Instead, whether in life or in legend, the legacy remained. Physicians began to question the wisdom of sealing rooms completely, weighing the harm of stagnant air against the fear of contagion. Some records hint that her case, though not named outright, was used in debates that slowly shifted medieval isolation practices. And still the tower stands, its walls weathered, its purpose forgotten by those who pass below. Yet if you look closely at the stones, you can see the uneven lines where the windows were once bricked, the faint traces of mortar hardened under hurried hands. They are the fingerprints of a moment when a court chose to wall away its future, whether to protect it or to hide it from the world.